In this video, I want to look at the Nirvana fallacy. The structure of the video is pretty straightforward. I'll describe the fallacy, I'll talk through its form, I'll look at some examples, and then I'll speculate at the end as to why I think people commit this fallacy. So first, let's describe the fallacy. The fallacy itself is pretty easy to describe, but I think it's difficult to understand the fallacy from its description. So the Nirvana fallacy is committed whenever an individual rejects a solution simply because there is a better possible solution out there. Or they reject the solution because the solution fails to solve all parts of the problem perfectly. The fallacy is sometimes called the perfect solution fallacy or the perfectionist fallacy. And the reason it's called that is because a lot of times it's understood as you reject any solution that is less than perfect. Okay, let's look at the form of the fallacy. So I'm going to give two different forms of the fallacy. The first one begins by pointing out a couple different solutions to a problem. So you might say for the premise, solutions B, C, and D are inferior to some hypothetical perfect solution A. And so therefore, you would conclude from the fact that you have these inferior solutions that those imperfect solutions should be rejected. So this is fallacious because the argument is invalid. The first premise, that is solutions B, C, D are inferior to a perfect solution A, can be true while the conclusion should be false. That is, there can be a reason why you should accept an imperfect solution over a more perfect solution. Let's look at a different way of formulating the form of this fallacy. The way of formulating it would be that pointing to a particular solution and then showing how that solution can't solve some aspect of a particular problem. And that aspect could only be solved by a hypothetically more perfect solution. And so since a solution can't solve every aspect of a problem, there's a specific aspect that it can't solve, you should reject that solution altogether. Again, the argument is invalid. It's invalid because the first premise can be true. That is, a solution can fail to solve a problem, but the conclusion can be false. That is, you should nevertheless accept this imperfect solution. So I think at this point you might say, well, why would I ever accept this imperfect solution? Well, there's some good reasons. I think to see these reasons, it's helpful to think about the missing premise that you would need to add to make the argument valid. So let's take one of the forms of the argument. So we start with, again, premise one, which is solutions B, C, and D are inferior to a perfect solution A. And so we have to think about, well, what premise would we need to add in order to make this argument valid? So I'll go ahead and pause the video and take a minute to see if you can think about what premise you would need to add in order to make the argument valid. Okay, welcome back. If you knew the premise, then you are an expert reasoner. Congratulations. The premise you would need to add is that we should always reject any solution that is inferior to a more perfect solution. This missing, usually unstated premise is false because there are cases where you should accept a solution that is inferior to a more perfect solution. The obvious cases would be when the more perfect solution is impossible, unrealistic, or too difficult to achieve in some way, shape, or form. So you'd have to, let's say, settle for a more practical solution, even though it doesn't solve all of the problems, or even though there is a hypothetical possible solution that would be more perfect. So to get clear about this idea, it's helpful to look through some examples. So let's turn to the examples next. Let's start with masks. So let's say we have this problem of people getting sick by the transmission of a particular type of virus, and we have an inferior solution to this problem. So the first premise reads, wearing a homemade mask does not provide sufficient protection from a particular virus since it doesn't provide complete protection. So it's an imperfect solution. It doesn't keep you immune from receiving or transmitting a particular virus. And there are better solutions out there. Having a medical grade mask or a respirator or putting yourself in a complete bubble, those would be better solutions to this particular problem because they would eliminate any chance of transmission. So the conclusion then would be that you shouldn't wear any homemade mask at all. The argument, though, would be invalid. Even though the mask doesn't provide complete protection, that it's an inferior solution to a problem, it doesn't mean that you should not wear a mask, because it does provide a partial solution to the problem. It reduces the likelihood of transmission. So even though it's an inferior solution, it might be more realistic if you don't have access to a medical grade mask or a respirator or a bubble to put yourself in. Let's look at another example. Next example I want to look at is drug education. So you might argue that drug education programs designed to educate people about the harms of hard drugs, addiction, things like that. These programs don't keep every single individual from using drugs. So it's an inferior solution to a problem. Well, you might reason from that inferior solution that because it doesn't keep everyone from using drugs, we should just abandon these drug education programs altogether. You shouldn't educate people about the harms of hard drug use. Again, this is invalid. Just because drug education programs aren't a perfect solution doesn't mean that they aren't effective, doesn't mean they don't reduce an individual's likelihood to commit drugs. I actually don't know if they do or they don't, but assuming that they do, this argument would be invalid. So it is an inferior solution, but just because it is inferior doesn't mean it should be rejected. Let's look at voting. I'm going to phrase this one in a different type of way. Let's say we're thinking about who to vote for in an upcoming election, and we see that a particular candidate isn't perfect in every single way. They are not a perfect solution to the problem of who you should vote for. The unstated premise here would be that you should never vote for anyone that is not an angel. You should only vote for these perfect beings that are out there. And then since you don't have a perfect solution to this problem, you only have an imperfect solution, you should not select candidate A. But again, premise 2 is false. No one is perfect in every single way, and so premise 2 would basically eliminate voting altogether. So in this last part of the video, I kind of want to speculate, and I'm interested to know your thoughts about why people might commit this fallacy. And I have 2 particular reasons. So I think the first reason why people commit this fallacy is they simply don't like the existing or realistic solutions, and so they want to reject that realistic solution in some way. But it's difficult to reject those solutions because they're the best available. And so since you don't have an alternative solution, the only way you can reject the best available solution is to point out how it fails against some more perfect solution. This sort of, though, ignores the practical realities of things. It ignores the fact that we're sort of forced to pick from the best available solutions, not pick from all of the possible solutions that are out there. So I want to look at one more case, one more reason why people might commit this fallacy. And this is, I think sometimes people have the worry that picking an imperfect solution will prevent them from achieving a perfect solution. But the interesting thing is it's actually a lot of times the other way around. That is, the desire for a perfect solution gets in the way of accepting an imperfect solution, which just makes your life miserable. So let me give you an example of this. Let's say you want to get married, and being married would make you happy. And there's a number of individuals who you could marry. You have candidates A, B, and C, and let's say of these individuals, you love A the most. But like everyone, nobody is perfect. And so these individuals are not perfect solutions to the problem of who I should marry, which candidate I should pick. So you say to yourself, well, since they all have failings in some way, shape, or form, I can't choose any of these. I can't accept the imperfect solution. Instead, I can only accept the perfect solution, some hypothetical possible individual D. And this person simply doesn't exist because there are no perfect people. So here, the perfect solution, that is finding that perfect candidate, actually prevents you from making an imperfect solution. That is, the desire for this perfect individual actually keeps you from picking an imperfect candidate who you would be wonderfully happy with. So you have this desire to be married. You would be happy if you satisfied this desire. But you also have this desire, or you only willing to accept the perfect candidate. And since you will only accept this perfect candidate, this perfect person to marry, it keeps you from choosing an imperfect candidate who you would love for all of your life. So in looking at this, rather than the imperfect solution preventing you from the perfect solution, what we have is that a desire for this perfect solution actually makes your life worse, because picking that imperfect solution would make you much happier. So this was the Nirvana fallacy. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have questions, concerns, or comments, or you have an example of the Nirvana fallacy, you can leave them in the comments down below and I'll be sure to reply.